We are back with more college football coverage and major news coming out of that region of the sports world, as you've already had things reach a boiling point by this time. Because, of course, the Daquan Wrights of the world, the Xavier Harrises of the world, the Junior Tui Halamakas of the world, all had at some point at least dressed up and, participated in the process of ingratiating themselves into the NFL after signing their contracts at the draft process. Whether or not they were selected or mostly undrafted, like a lot of the players are who got this temporary restraining order, as I mentioned in the last video. They, of course, could not really go back to their teams as constructed. And so they sought out the opportunity to acquire rights to enter the transfer portal, with all three of those players somehow transferring over to LSU. Of course, that injunction and the temporary restraining order itself granted rights to over 30 athletes across all sports, including apparently another that they didn't outline. A lot of you have heard about R.J. Lewis Jr. and how his draft stock kind of tanked after his final season at St. John's. Somehow, someway, the man had actually gotten some time at the G League, if I'm not mistaken. And somehow, someway, as this report stated, he somehow also got a temporary injunction to play for LSU from a Louisiana judge. Obviously, that program for LSU is run by Will Wade, and honestly, you can just question how ethical both Lane Kiffin and Will Wade truly are with how they both got to LSU in the first place. It's literally so easy to understand. It does not take a rocket scientist to see the trends that both of those two have rode over the past few years to get to their respective destinations. And yet, again, it's going down. Seemingly, R.J. Lewis Jr., per that report, was slated to come back despite signing a contract, even if he was undrafted, with a legitimate NBA team. So again, all over the place. You have players who know that they might not necessarily be superstars and, bona fide top selections in these drafts, taking the very loophole that the NCAA is leaving in and using it to their advantage, which again, I can't blame them for. But of course, it has brought on a number of different conversations to this time. And, hey, the complaints are fair. Even the SEC themselves had a statement on Monday about it, and you just have to keep said statement in mind. As they said here, quote, college athletes, not former professional athletes, have been at the heart of the Southeastern Conference. Individuals who choose to leave college athletics, sign professional playing contracts, and compete professionally should not then be permitted to return to college competition. Allowing that to occur will blur the line between college and professional sports, create significant competitive equity concerns, and reduce opportunities for high school and current college athletes. College sports are for college athletes. The current confusion around national eligibility standards emphasizes the need to advance the Protect College Sports Act. End quote. So that statement reads more like a promotion of the Protect College Sports Act, which has been going out across this entire time. Again, it's Ted Cruz and another person working on this specific piece of litigation, and they're trying to get it out into the limelight to have it become law. Which, again, depending on how certain things go, it's certainly possible. But even with said promotion, and even with them making it clear that it's not something that they want to happen in their conference, you actively have teams like LSU weaponizing it. And I kid you not, even with everything that I'm about to get into, you see Lane Kiffin on a DoorDash commercial. So they're not even hiding this at this point. But I digress. Even if you're sending out that message as a conference, the other teams in there can still find their own way around it, like LSU is right now, and like Ole Miss seems to be suffering, in a sense, from something that people can debate the legitimacy of and the ethical ramifications of. So we get that portion of everything on Monday. And then all hell breaks loose yesterday as of the recording of this video. Because in the morning, you see on your breaking news screen, even with Daquan Wright set to make history, the Big Ten did what? Oh yeah, they passed a rule in their specific conference that is going to put a ban on all of this movement. As this report states from ESPN, and again, keep in mind, this was early in the morning. This was at like 9:41, as this report states. The Big Ten has passed a rule that stops players returning from the NFL for playing for one of its schools. Any player who was declared for the NFL draft and did not withdraw, appeared on an NFL roster, or signed a contract with a pro league cannot be on a Big Ten roster, the league announced Tuesday in a statement. The Big Ten's athletic directors unanimously approved the rule, which then received unanimous approval later from the conference's faculty athletic representatives, sources told ESPN's Pete Thamel. Any teams in violation of the rule would be subject to its head coach being suspended for 50% of its remaining games plus an undisclosed fine, the Big Ten confirmed. End quote. And you're thinking to yourself, damn, that is a warning shot if you've ever seen one. Through all the noise that has gone on over this course of time, you wanted to see whether or not it would be the NCAA to initiate this kind of rule incorporation, or whether it would fall on one of the conferences, if not maybe more, to make this decision and put it out there. And, from the way that this is being put out, the Big Ten got out in front of it. They decided that even with these players seemingly not having a lot of ties to any of our programs, we're going to put the word out that something like this, a player literally signing away their rights to an NFL roster and then having the ability to come back to college football, is not acceptable, is not legal, and we will not stand for it. It does not uphold from the ethical standpoint, and we cannot give that any merit, any more merit than we would, with other situations of impropriety here. And in that event, hey, you're not going to have your best option at coach for a while. You're going to face a fine. That's a very baseline punishment. But, I think that's a little dependent as well on just how much of this was bound to happen. The nature of this does seem to change a little bit. Because just sparking this up now forces a lot of other independent bodies to act here. In theory, as they state, it's not saying that this couldn't still happen in other conferences. And like I said, there are hundreds of cases just like this, just like Thomas Castellanos and a number of other players all across the country right now relating to college eligibility for a potential fifth year at their school or another school of their choosing. You've seen a lot of this about the SEC. Again, Anthony Hankerson, Oregon State product, that's pseudo Pac-12 territory. So it's not really dealing with any Big Ten team or player, at least from everything that has been reported. But again, there are a bunch of names in there. And you, at the very least, put it out there that it will not stand in your conference. And maybe, by proxy, it shouldn't in others. And so you have this waiting game, really, for a while, just to see how everyone else would react to it. And you got some varying results. You had attempts for other conferences seemingly meeting up and potentially talking about this come up in the minds of many of the people writing about this. And as Ross Dellinger from Yahoo Sports stated, quote, as reported below, conferences have been exploring the idea of creating league-only rules banning pro players, something that the SEC is expected to consider during this week's meetings. Dellinger wrote on Twitter/X, "The Big Ten is meeting later today to consider a league-wide rule, and SEC presidents are expected to direct ADs against accepting pro players under threat of penalty. Per bylaws, Greg Sankey under presidents hold authority to deem a player ineligible, fine or suspend coaches, etc. And will they?" Dellinger later reported the Big 12 is also considering this rule, meaning all 4 power conferences would be in alignment, not allowing pro players to leave the NFL and return to college football. End quote. So that's from Ross Dellinger's perspective, and it is something to take into account. Again, it all goes back to the idea of the NCAA not being able to govern themselves. And the only way, seemingly, that a change, widespread change, in the college football landscape would come about in this respect and maybe a few others, in terms of eligibility, is to have conferences on the same page. You know, we are at the end of the day trying to compete with each other in a sense, trying to secure our own media rights, trying to get the biggest brands, the biggest exposure possible. But if we can unite as a solidified body and come to an agreement that something like this cannot, last in the college football landscape, then hey, we may have the authority to really, counteract these moves and actually put something in motion that can get the job done. So, as these conferences have these meetings across, these different teams and with all the different members of these teams, that's something you're bound to come across a lot over this time. Now, as, you had this report first break out, you had a number of different statements about it. On the one end, to that point, some people decided to say that, hey, the Big Ten does deserve a little bit of credit for getting out in front of it and setting the tone, maybe, for what could follow after such a move and such a monumental decision. Again, all players, as I said, are not villains in this case, as you will have some of these fifth-year players who legitimately need that extra year in a sense because they lost one or maybe a few due to medical redshirting. Look no further than a guy like Tyon Grant Foster at Gonzaga in the basketball sense, literally having to spend 7 years in college because a lot of those were spent dealing with a debilitating medical condition that kept him out for multiple seasons and forced him to take on multiple redshirt years. That's why he was still eligible. There is nothing wrong with that. What this is saying is that once you make the decision to put pen to paper in the NFL, and even before that, if you make the decision knowing that there could be something up with you, underlying, or that you don't have the means or the resources to become a legitimate NFL player at this time, if you're recognizing that and you still end up putting your name into the NFL draft and not withdrawing before the specific time as they go through the entire process, there is no path for you to come back to college football after that. You are no longer a student athlete at this institution. You have given that right away the second you enter the NFL draft, the second you sign a contract, and the second you shoot up on the football field. Whether you are actually playing out there or, again, just dressing up like they eventually said Daquan Wright was doing. There's just no place for it. Yet, at this time, the opportunity is still there. So that shifts in the player's mind. Well, the Big Ten is off limits, but hey, we still have the other other Power 4 conferences in this bracket still open. These are all still some pretty major schools here, and we still can seize a bit of an opportunity to capitalize for ourselves and secure another year of eligibility if we so choose. There's absolutely no issue with that whatsoever. Then on the other side of things, some people had their own opinions. You literally get Booger McFarland talking about essentially the Big Ten isn't slick and that they know exactly what they're doing from the standpoint that it does put them in good graces. The SEC has all this going on right now. And as Paul Fonbaum, watching the First Take show yesterday, later went on to say again, it's not like the Big Ten themselves has not had to deal with a lot of impropriety and, unethical actions over the past few years in their conference across their teams. It's pretty bold. It's pretty slick to send that message about college eligibility when your conference has also been marred in its own controversy over the past few seasons in a row with some of their respective teams in the league. And again, that's a fair point as well. The Big Ten has had overall, as a collective, their own BS in their system. You can look at the Michigans of the world and it goes so much deeper than that. Although it's been a hotbed for disaster. Even Ohio State, in something that I did not talk about per se, but I had read about it. There was something with one of their higher-ups having to step down after some allegedly, not to say corrupt, but there was an affair that had no place of, occurring whatsoever in that system while he's leading the entire school. And as a result, you had Ted Carter Jr. step down. That was a controversy. So again, no one is necessarily making out of this situation as a completely perfect institution. Everybody has displayed their own form of corruption and impropriety in some sense. Yet for this one, the SEC, in having the Big Ten jump ahead of them and make this decision, it put them under a little bit of pressure. It put them on the clock, if you will. And some source, as was told to Ross Dellinger, some source said this is Greg Sankey's Sorsby moment. We're talking about the commissioner of the SEC being likened to having a similar juxtaposition with the Brendan Sorsby saga that rocked the entire college football world across pretty much the last 5 to 6 months. If that's the comparison we're having to this, clearly in that building and clearly in that conference, you'd address this as a much larger situation. An urgent situation as well. So, all those claims are fair. And, it can come off as a little strange, but you can see where they would be coming from when they're talking about it. Safe to say, though, that they could, in a way, have anticipated something like this coming. And at the same time, just 8 hours later, look back at their feeds, look back at specific calls, and just question, okay, whoa. What the hell is going on? That's literally all it took. All it took. 8 hours of just waiting to see what would happen next. And the Big Ten making this decision on their own would be enough of a story, individually. Then at around 5 to 6 o'clock yesterday, the other report comes in. The second conference has joined the party. As they state across multiple sources, the SEC followed suit. They themselves, quote, have joined the Big Ten Conference and taking action to prevent NFL players and other professional athletes from returning to college athletics and competing for member institutions. And that they announced the conference's policy Tuesday evening. It applies to men's and women's college basketball as well, while prohibiting an athlete from playing for an SEC member program if they previously declared for the NFL, NBA, or WNBA drafts and did not withdraw from them, signed a professional contract, or had been listed on a professional roster. Same kind of language here as that of the Big Ten. And that is a direct shot that will affect RJ Lewis Jr. Again, draft stock definitely declined on his end. And even when I talked about that happening in that specific draft, I called it unfortunate. You never want to see yourself go through that as a player. At the same time, if you were cognizant of this information, he still made the decision, despite all of that, to enter the NBA draft and get picked up by a G League roster. So he's already been there. He's already experienced some form of professional basketball play. And now he wants to take his talents back to that after spending at least a good year or so in that system. There's just no shot that something like that is allowed. You'd also question that pretty much all the moves that LSU got relating to these players in Harris, in Tui Halamaka, and in Daquan Wright, those could be pending their own form of investigation if they are serious about upholding this standard now and making sure that all these teams abide by it. And the quote here tells you everything you need to know. They said that the Big Ten schools had a unanimous vote on it, and the same goes for the SEC. Quote, the vote to implement the policy was 16-0, an important show of unity from conference leaders at a time when some of their own coaches are attempting to add players to their rosters who are cut from professional teams. And that's a very interesting thing to know. That would include LSU. I think that the people who end up voting on these decisions are more than likely like the ADs and higher ups for these schools, not the head coaches themselves. But, hey, clearly, if you look at the reporting too, they mention how they wanted to encourage and, drive their ADs in the conference to vote on this and make sure that they could implement this policy. That could be a very awkward, conversation with Thamel and the AD for LSU in no short order, depending on how things end up going. But in all seriousness, as they state for their policy, this is what it specifically looks like. Following meetings with the presidents, chancellors, and athletics directors of the Southeastern Conference, the SEC will enforce the following policy. An SEC institution is not permitted to have an athlete on its roster who has previously declared for the NFL, NBA, or WNBA draft and did not appropriately withdraw, signed a contract with an NFL, NBA, or G League, or WNBA, or affiliate team, or been listed on an NFL, NBA, or G League, or WNBA roster. The commissioner is authorized to enforce this expectation with penalties against member institutions. So keep that in mind. Because the first part of that policy literally sets the tone for everything else. If you're not going to get quality time, you should just stay where you are. It's a hard pill for some people to swallow. Again, you're going to have some guaranteed money, potentially, in the college basketball and college football worlds, with them being two of the, for that matter, the two largest sources of, revenue in terms of the specific sports in college space. That is how those two operate. You're getting a large percentage of the share for those sports. So there's obviously a lot of value in that. Yet, just stick with accepting that in the short term rather than trying to play this long game and try to test your value out. Fall short, step foot into these institutions and then decide to come back whenever you see fit. Can't have it. And even if you do somehow make it through that first step, if you don't withdraw and you still believe that you are, you're in the dance, you have yourself an opportunity, you don't even have to play. You don't even have to play. You don't have to really participate in anything that is seen as significant to the roster building for said team. As long as you're there, if you're falling on their list of players in the database, if you've signed that contract, it is over. Simply put. So all three levels, it just rises up consistently. And, it is something that, one could argue might be a little bit of, reactionary response for both conferences. Yet, if you didn't have these reports of the Big Ten doing it and then the SEC doing it, well, who was going to? Would you think that the NCAA would take time, to make this decision themselves when we've constantly been talking about how they struggle to enforce these rules and how they have consistently needed other third-party sources to get these other kinds of, enforcements situated. That's how it's been. And that probably would not change as quickly as this situation right here. Of course, as they mentioned here, you have to be cognizant of other, forms of this coming from other conferences. It's genuinely important. As it states for the USA Today Sports article made by Lucy, though, quote, the ACC declined to comment on the matter in an email to USA Today Sports. Similar requests to the Big Ten and Big 12 were not immediately returned, but of course the Big Ten announced this rule. So again, you haven't heard from a lot of these other conferences about it directly from their spokespeople or however the case may be, but at the very least, it is something that is bound to come up in their conversations when they convene about this, because they just showed you what this could look like. And it makes for a larger conversation and a larger question as well. Again, does this ploy for the SEC, especially when they themselves were talking about wanting to secede from the NCAA entirely, as crazy as that sounded, and as much as people can assume that this is likely for money, when they first stated that something like this could happen, at the same time, it is cases like these that give them more merit and give them more grounds to do it. After all, the SEC and the Big Ten, you want to talk about owning a large percentage of the revenue share, they are the two most profitable conferences in college sports. It's not particularly close either. And the Big 12 and the ACC, even with their media rights deals in place, they are still trying to catch up. The top teams in each of the SEC and the Big Ten are reining in, the kind of money that puts you near the double-digit billions worth of dollars. Like, there's no joke about that. So you are clearly making bank as an independent body here. And you now make this move that enforces a ban on players trying to re-enter college sports after participating in some fashion, or at the very least signing up to participate in professional sports. With decisions like that being made, it's going to move the totem pole a little bit. Again, the NCAA may not be in the power of that particular organization anymore. The players are running laps around them, and I meant what I said when I said that. But now you also have the Big Ten and the SEC coming out and showing you multiple times over the past year that they can have their way and that they can, compromise when they see fit. But for the most part, they have the upper hand on you. Again, as crazy as it said, and was at the time, when I saw something about the Big Ten trying to get a, 3/4 share, a 3/4 share of the conference or college football playoff teams in the bracket, I'm like, whoa, hold on. That's aggressive. Stuff like that does, really that can't happen. But again, what exactly are you going to do about it? Because here you have these same conferences making a decision on something that you can enforce. And another aspect of it as well, to move on from that point, even if all of the Power 4 conferences were to all join together and enforce this, because again, with those being the big dog conferences, the Big 12 and the ACC could be inspired to follow suit because of them, rather than bending to the will, whatever of it the NCAA possesses. That's how that would trend out. So, that is obviously something to look forward to in this entire situation. But yeah, you have other conferences that exist as well. Now, no, they're not going to bring in the same kind of money. This would really test, just how much players are willing to sacrifice that in order to go back to college football. Because if all that is closed off, you're not getting exposure from any of the top teams in the nation. At least in theory, from a prestige and exposure standpoint. I don't think that these same people would be motivated. And it would be wild if that was the case. Again, the money is something that some might truly need. And so they would. For those players who, are genuinely trying to take their talents to a good roster, though, you're less likely at that time to choose to go to a program like Sacramento State as a fifth-year player, knowing that they aren't contending for anything. And that, Sacramento State just got implemented as a D1 football team. You'd watch out, honestly, for a program like North Dakota State. But even they themselves, after spending time in FCS play, working their asses off as one of the best FCS teams ever, to ultimately be called up to FBS D1. You'd think they want to sacrifice that kind of status as a truly good program from an athletic standpoint to bring in fifth-year players who, again, don't have the excuse of a medical redshirt and are simply just trying to circumvent that system to get one extra year out of it. Again, a lot of these people might have sat because, again, playing time was scarce at their position. But for the most part, by your third year, by your fourth year, or after at least a redshirt year, this is likely changed in some fashion. And it still displayed that you clearly were not as good as you thought you were at said sport to not get that kind of trust from your team. So you cannot, again, recognizing that, just move straight on to the pros and then try to come back because it didn't work. No, it either does or it does not. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot try to fit both timelines here. You have to choose. You have to choose. It's that simple. For another component, because you had Ryan Day come out and say something pretty interesting. As they say in this initial report surrounding the Big Ten's decision, quote, Day said Monday that he hopes to speak soon with Big Ten Commissioner Tony Petitti about creating a conference-wide rule that establishes a date after which schools cannot add players to their current roster. Because again, to my point in the last video, if we can have Harris and Wright especially, they mention the idea of a ghost transfer. If we can have that implemented this late in the cycle and this, close to the start of the college football season, what's stopping other players from attempting to abuse that over and over again? So that is another piece of litigation extending beyond this point that could come through. And I think that's something that probably should be put in place. Because it's like, damn, after a while, the timing of the window wasn't wholly agreed on, but okay. Ultimately, we all got down to the brass tacks and we decided that early January, was going to be the best time for it. So why in the world do we have player movement as late as fucking August 23rd? And quite literally with, documentation that just didn't seem to be existent for Ole Miss. The previous SEC bylaw said as much, because they were mentioning, something about this kind of specific problem being implemented in their system. And it turned out to be another loophole. Per their section 14.5 previously under transfer litigations, it said that, quote, a transfer student, including a graduate transfer from a member institution, may be eligible for intercollegiate competition during the individual's initial academic year in residence at a member institution, provided the student provides written notification of transfer to the institution within their sport's regular NCAA transfer window immediately following the sports championship segment. And that you had the exception for a coach departure following that. This section also later goes into waivers. Yes, you do have the written notification in the sense that, okay, it's going to LSU, but no contact with your former school is suspicious already. Then again, this is not immediately following the transfer window. This is not immediately following the sports championship segment. It literally took place over 7 months later for Daquan Wright to sit down, clear waivers, and make the decision that he would go back to college football and then transfer, finally, to LSU. Again, you're playing the long game here, and it doesn't necessarily state that, but clearly, by not defining it early, it allowed for something like that to potentially take place. So again, I referenced that it's not the same thing anymore. They've obviously revised it with that decision on their new policy enacted yesterday. But man, again, hey, will it truly stop other players from trying to do this with other conferences? It'll probably discourage a lot. Again, the exposure is not the same between the Big Ten, SEC schools compared to other Power 4 conferences, and it's not the same when you compare Power 4 conferences at large to other college football conferences across the nation. That's just the truth. That's just how the money has been in that sport. That's how it's been flowing across that landscape for a long time. And it does not really seem like it would slow down. You can always have those underdog schools and the group of 6 programs rising up to again make their own noise and get themselves a shot to enter something like the college football playoff, which is what I was on the side of. and what so many other people were bitching and complaining about at that time. But for this conversation, do those programs in those other conferences decide to make this as unified as possible, getting the entire college football world together and taking a stand against this movement? Because that is really the only way, seemingly, now you would put a stop to all of this for good. Like, you're still going to have a lot of these cases being fought until the very end, until it is laid down that at no college football institution in any of the college football conferences or in any sport across any conference in the college world can you enter into the pros at any time and then decide to come back. That defeats the entire purpose of amateurism. You know, the NCAA had to literally beckon to the will of the House in the NCAA settlement that continues to be referenced to this point, and which brought back NIL, very recently. Again, it's exploded. And while a lot of these conferences have, adjusted to it, we're, having our own struggles with retaining some players. But okay, we're trying to play ball. The second that you're breaking the label of amateurism, we have to put a stop to it. Because once you enter the pros, you can always say for the test of time that you went to the NBA, that you got drafted into the NBA, that you at least had some experience in the NBA or the NFL or wherever you perform in a pro level league. You're bringing that back to college now with all of this intel and information on how pro teams are run. That can't work that way. So just a major shakeup here. And again, you have to monitor how everyone else follows it. Between the Power 4 conferences as well as all of the other conferences across all of the other sports, especially the major sports. This is, of course, involving a lot of other teams. It's mainly centering around football and basketball, as, we see here. So once you hurt that specific player movement there, you kind of send a message elsewhere to say that this can't happen. And that would be very interesting if they are to do that. Yeah, that looks like that will do it for this one. Just a lot to go through there. But I hope you guys, were informed by everything here and at least have some form of understanding now in regards to this entire thing. And peace.